we see that we can solve this problem in next, say, 5 or 10 years. If we do that, we would be very lucky. And it's not that there are not many kind of success stories. There are very many success stories. The institutions have built their businesses. You will hear from entrepreneurs here. The investors have taken those kind of calls and focused on the sectors. But considering the problem that we have, this is not that kind of in the quantum that we can say that we can safely address that in 5 to 10 years. So I think there is also discourse about that, how much capital it requires. I think I'll not give the number for energy sector, but for the climate, the number that we talk about is in trillion. So we talk about that additional financing of 4 to 5 trillion is required every year to meet our climate goals. Now that's the money that is not yet available with the public sector or philanthropies. So the challenge is that, can we get the private sector? For those, to give you a context, the private sector manages more than $430 trillion. So they are the one who can come to the rescue and giving you additional capital. Yet that money is not flowing because of the several challenges, either at the geography level, at the sector level, or at a business model level. So in this conversation, we'll try to extract those insights and find out what we can do together. So if I can invite my first speaker to give a slightly more detailed nuances of the sector. And I think you have presentation, Mr. Wilmot, so if I can ask you to get with the presentation and provide your initial remarks. And when you're doing that, you can briefly introduce your firm and give context about your own journey so that the audience knows about that. We just did not introduce everyone knowingly that we want to hear your journey from your own mouth. So over to you.
Okay, so am I to make the presentation or is it ready?
It's just ready, I think.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to be with you. My name is Wilmot Allen, and I wear a couple of different hats. I am, for this panel, here in the capacity of managing director for Africa for a cold storage company, solar-powered cold storage, called D-Grid Energy out of Potomac, Maryland. I'm based here. And we have a short presentation. If it's difficult, I definitely can speak off of my notes. Okay. And what we're going to show is the Solar Cool Cube, which sounds really good about now, given I have a towel in my hand and I'm sweating. A Solar Cool Cube system that is part of our investment into the renewable energy ecosystem that we hope to also bridge with the to address the financing gap through the mobilization of carbon credits. So Solar Cool Cube system, again, is a product out of Potomac, Maryland. We have a presence here in Africa and have sold across Africa. It's a system that I will tell you more about. Next slide, please. I think we all know the problems. That's why we're here. And we're here also to talk about the solutions. But let me just briefly underscore some of the financing gap. We know about energy poverty globally, particularly as it relates to agribusiness. And we understand how that disenables growth and constrains the flourishing of livelihoods. I always say that among sectors now that a lot of the private capital is investing in, consumer wellness and health is probably the most urgent one. And we saw that not only because of COVID, but because if you're not healthy, you can't use that FinTech app, or you can't go to that amazing school, or buy that amazing whatever outfit through an e-commerce property. And so we see that there's a tremendous financing gap that's needed across the world, and particularly here in Africa, we will focus on that. Next slide, please. This is our solution. I'm not going to bore you by going through every word of the slide. I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. So it is something that we came up with about 5 years ago. And it's adaptable, it's modular, it's resilient in the context of extreme temperatures and bad weather. It's easy to install as well. Modular 20 cubic meter up to 100 and more. Next slide, please. And it can be on the grid, off the grid, or hybrid. Next slide, please. And this slide is really to communicate a couple of things. More of the universality of the challenge. It's not just in the developed world, but also in the developing world, but also in the developed world, particularly in what we call in the US, domestic emerging markets, where we see, in terms of the global challenge, 2 billion people currently face food insecurity. In Washington, D.C., where I'm from, 1 in 10 residents deal with the same issue. And the IMF estimate that 120 million people are projected as food insecure as of last year. Next slide. So what is our commitment to this? It's to provide carbon sequestration technology that will be used in agriculture, dairy, and horticulture supply chains. We aspire that this will reduce hydrocarbon usage through renewable energy and methane elimination. And we're deploying these products across the continent. We have a unique model called cooling as a service, not original in that it's, first of all, a terminology that's used for software, but cooling as a service whereby we promote ecosystem interventions, whereby we provide units, large units to fish hubs, agricultural hubs, even to telcos actually now. And that provides an opportunity for the end user to lease that space out or the service out to others so that there's a wider and larger footprint of impact. And we also are exploring other models with this, and you can see and read better than I can probably explain it, some of the other points there. But the bottom line is that we have tried to make this cooling access something that's cheaper for a broader part of the population across the continent through various partnerships that we have and various customers we have along many different verticals. So I'll stop there. And let me just say a couple things, just from the standpoint of an entrepreneur on the topic of financing. What we find is that in talking to the investment community, the number one thing that they're looking for is aggregation. So a challenge for most entrepreneurs is that I have a great product or a great solution, but the scale of it is not large enough, particularly we're finding this out in cold storage, to attract private capital. Now, I think we are beginning to see that the need is so great that there are facilities emerging and more capital providers are now starting to take a look at this. My recommendation is this. I formerly worked at the IFC in infrastructure. I also wear a hat as a partner in a diversified healthcare and customer wellness private equity firm out of South Africa. It's this, that the development finance institutions, the fund of funds, should now require the GPs, if they invest in, to have a carbon strategy. What I mean by that, so if you look historically, IFC has been one of the innovators when it comes to ESG and made it sort of customary standard now for every fund to require an ESG strategy. Also, we, very late, but we've come to understand the importance of a gender lens. And now it's not just impact investors that have that criteria now as an important part of an investment strategy. For Africa, just as we saw technology and entrepreneurship get ahead of policy, I think now the time has come for more capital providers to require that of the GPs that they give money to, so that we can see a wider diversification of deployment of capital throughout Africa across very many sectors. This is the last point I'll make, and that's this. Even with our healthcare fund, when I first joined the fund, it's a family of funds out of South Africa. The fund very sort of myopically invested only in healthcare infrastructure, hospitals, and also some clinics. But in response to the market need, not just because of COVID, but also the various applications of healthcare to consumer wellness, the investment strategy has expanded so that now we are considering cold storage and other renewable energy dimensions of healthcare that previously were not as important to healthcare sector focused funds. And I think that if we all take a look at wherever we stand as a capital provider, as an entrepreneur, and understand how all things are possible now, given technology, given human will, given resources, that this is not a very big pivot, so that whether it's an incubator, a capital provider, or wherever you stand in the ecosystem, to have a carbon strategy is not just something that's marginal, but it's core to what you do. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilma. I think the point you make about the best practices and what we should be looking while we are investing is well put. I think we should be focusing on the carbon strategy, the gender strategy, and focusing on those sectors which require attention. And I think the venture that you represent here is very well a kind of needed, considering the kind of situation we are getting in. From a venture that you are setting up to kind of moving on to a venture that has done brilliant in terms of scaling up, in terms of showcasing what a startup can reach and reach scale in a very, very short amount of time. So I would like to invite Justice from Bbox to talk about his journey and his kind of insight that how we can scale investment over multiple rounds, how we can get the market and regulatory challenges overcome to achieve the scale that we are looking at. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Justus. Just a bit of background about myself. I come from Bbox. A few years ago, when I was a university student, I started doing a project with a group of students from Imperial College London, doing solar energy kiosks to address access to electricity in a remote community somewhere in Rwanda. And among those students, out of them, 3 of them would become Bbox founders a few years later. And I've been lucky to be on this journey for the past 10 years plus. Our mission is to create impact and unlock opportunities in the different communities where we are. So we've been able to impact over 4 million people, more than half of those being children, and primarily on electricity access in rural communities. Bbox is now in more than 10 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. In East Africa here is mainly here in Kenya and in Rwanda. And we have presence as well in the DRC and multiple of other West African countries. So to your point, what can be done? I think, I might be a little bit controversial here, but I do actually think that as a sector, there was a glimpse of hope a few years back, and that really accelerated the birth and the growth of so many entrepreneurs in the market. But I would say that it's much more, unfortunately, it's much more difficult to raise money today than it was in 2019. And I think I would say that investors or the different partners that play a role in the funding space, I would say that they've not taken full responsibility. If you look at the climate community, the impact community, and I do agree with you that the private sector can put most of the funding on the table, but I still think that there's a big role to play with the impact community and the climate community, with governments and policies to be able to unlock that funding. In our experience, as I said, it's been a bit difficult to raise funding. We've been successful in different ways, but I would say that for our customers specifically, they are still the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. I'll give an example in Kenya, and we saw bits of that in Rwanda with the past 3 years, seeing droughts in some parts of the country. That simply means for the rural person is that their income drastically drops, and they get back to poverty. What it also means for businesses like ours, serving those people, is that their ability to pay is affected. So if they were paying for your product or using it, putting the payment aside, actually using it because they only got it because they need it as a basic need. If they were using it 85% of the time, that goes down to 60% of the time when they have to prioritize food and other needs. So how do we address one side? If entrepreneurs are innovating and bringing all these solutions, if there is no investment to address the impact of the climate change on those people, to make sure that they are able to still plant and harvest in dry seasons, then businesses like ours will suffer. So for me, we need joint efforts from the different players, including impact investors, multilateral institutions, governments. And I never leave out governments, for sure. Nothing happens until a government is really willing to make it happen. And I think, for me, I've been encouraged with what I've seen in the private space in terms from the entrepreneur point of view. There's a lot of willingness, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of youthful, creative, new ideas of doing things. But they haven't had enough funding to explore, and I don't think what they are trying to solve, not many people are trying to solve this. So there are a few people who are trying, and I don't think they are getting the right attention. So I'll stop at that and give it back.
Thank you, Justice. I think you make some very valid argument for the role of different partners to come together to solve the investment challenge. It cannot be done only by the private sector. It requires the philanthropic capital, it requires the government, public finance, and it requires the right kind of approach to support the entrepreneurs. And we are all privy to that changing environment of investment, that how it is happening. And I think that leads to my next speaker. Victor, if I can ask you to provide some insights on what are the kind of barriers that you see in this driving investment in solar sector, and if you have any role of local capital or the other form of capital coming together to drive these things. If you have any insights on that, you have been working in that space, so happy to hear from that. And I'm just kind of giving a heads up to Anas to think about your response about how the blended finance can be leveraged, because you have been managing funds, and there were a number of comments from Wilmore and Justice that highlights that what role the financing ecosystem can play in this. And obviously the fund managers are not the only one who can drive the change, but we can surely think of the better ways of doing this together. So first Victor, and then Anas. And Victor, if you can stick to the timeline, I think I want to get back to all of you. One more round with a very quick remark. So if you can stick to 4 to 5 minutes, that would be great. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. My name is Victor Ndiege. I'm the CEO of Kenya Climate Ventures. We are an impact investor based here in Nairobi, currently investing in Kenya only, but have ambitions for the region as well. So I want to give a bit of, what is out there is that statistics is telling us that by 2030, we need to triple the energy access levels to be able to keep up with the demographic growth, with the economy, with all aspects that relate to improvement of livelihood, so that we can grow as a continent. So that's bottom line. So whether we do something about it or not, it is coming, and it's in the next 7 years. My experience working at Kenya Climate Ventures and previously working for a continent-wide challenge fund is that most of the opportunities for realizing reasonable energy access lie with small and medium enterprises, and in certain cases also with growth stage enterprises. Now, an example, I have a privilege of witnessing the growth of Bbox from a small town in Kenya here in Homa Bay County to a regional enterprise that requires to grow from time to time. And I saw them grow amongst other enterprises which faced a lot of challenges. And one of it is just the fact that when you are small and beginning to grow, there is a lot of perception about how risky you are as an enterprise to be able not only to absorb money, but to use that money to achieve the kind of impact that you're talking about. So you don't have a track record yet, and you are beginning to tell the market that I can do it. So that's a big limitation. And solving this limitation does not only require, the conventional approach to offering capital, but it requires a more appropriate kind of capital, which in this case has been blanketed as blended finance, but it has more into it than blended finance. So in my context, blended finance would be, the nature of capital, the kind of instruments and the kind of businesses that are targeted with the kind of finance that is in the market. So for such businesses to be able to thrive is not an easy one, and more so in the energy sector where there is a lot of focus on established and large-scale projects. So that is one of the reasons why the growing, small and growing businesses cannot access capital so easily, because every capital provider would want to associate themselves with success. And it is success that very few investors are willing to grow with. And so you find a lot of capital is available for mega projects, but not for the small and growing businesses. So just the fact that you're small and growing is already a risk. The other aspect is about the investment horizon. So every time, investors put money into enterprises, this is dictated that we are giving you capital for the next 3-5 years. But the growth pattern of these enterprises and energy projects are quite different from what some of the investors prescribe. So then the enterprises end up either losing the money or taking the money because they need it, but end up not supporting their own growth path, which should be more organic so that they can grow a proper track record. So part of the problem is us investors. And a last one, one of the panelists mentioned about the public sector, and I want to say that local capital is very important. And local capital in the context of local currency, but also local investors trying to put money into enterprises that are domiciled in their own geographies for them to grow. And I want to put it that for any meaningful growth of businesses in the energy sector, we still need to mobilize more of local capital tailored to the effect that we use it to leverage other investors from outside the region so that we can grow. And that is what Kenya Climate Ventures is trying to do in the Kenyan market. Thank you.
Thank you, Viktor. I think you made some very valid point and some concerns that have been always there, that the small and medium enterprises often get kind of a very poor supply of capital because of the inherent challenges that they have. But in order to kind of make these enterprises succeed, we need to think of a different strategy, what that he was talking about, having local currency capital, etc. But Anas, coming to you, in fact, you have been looking at the sectors and very, minutely, and you have a large fund that you manage. 2-3 points, I think, as an investor, how do you see the energy sector playing it up? And so the challenge that we are talking about, the lack of local capital, what I hear is lack of capital in local currency. So capital that is coming into local currency, not into the currencies which are not. A second thing is that, is there any learning that we have got so far so that we can do things differently to catalyze the solar space a bit more rapidly than what is happening? And third, any insight that you have from your journey as being a GP, being the fund manager, what is your call to the pools of capital, that how they should kind of enable you to deliver the goods better than what you have been doing so far.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anas Sharafi. I'm a senior director at Africa 50 for energy. I oversee the development of projects in the energy space. So my colleagues here gave some good perspectives around what I would call decentralized solutions. I'd like to provide a bit of a different perspective on larger scale projects because, of course, they are a big part of the solution. And what I would start by saying is that, unfortunately, despite the immense potential that we see in Africa, which is real, it's widely distributed, what we have seen so far is somewhat limited in terms of investment. So over the last decade, we're talking about 10 gigawatts of solar power coming on the grids, about $20 billion of investments. So depending on where we're coming from, those might look like big numbers, but in fact, Africa could easily accommodate hundreds of gigawatts of solar power today. So why is it that we haven't been able to make much more progress? There have been some good successes, but as my colleague said earlier, quite concentrated on a few countries, including South Africa, Morocco, Egypt. So in Egypt, for example, Africa 50 developed and invested in a 400 megawatt solar. There's a 1.5 gigawatt solar park that has been quite successful. There have been good initiatives in Senegal, in South Africa, etc. But these have not been deployed enough at scale. So the main issues that we've seen these large stages. And there, we would like coming to fill this gap, and we are seeing some initiatives. I think blended capital can play a big role there, because if you have a purely commercial approach to project development and expect commercial returns, those can be quite high because the risk is quite significant. The risk of failure when you start developing a project and spending capital is real. And so a blended finance approach there can be very successful. So at Africa 50, we are working with the African Development Bank to launch the Africa Green Alliance for Infrastructure, which is exactly going to take this blended approach, mobilizing philanthropic capital from foundations, etc., some commercial capital, in order to operate in the project development space, and so be able to do so for green projects, with lesser return expectations, and with tools that are a bit more adapted to developers. The second issue that we've seen is the issue of public sector capacity, and of course that's not necessarily at the same level of severity everywhere, but it is definitely an issue. These projects are quite complex, require quite a bit of technical expertise, but we've seen that this can be bridged quite well by using advisors. So what we've done in some of our projects is either mobilize financing for advisors that advise the governments, or in fact pay for the advisors ourselves, with the advisors having a fiduciary duty to the governments. And so that enables governments to be equipped to negotiate with developers, and it can really help. Another way is to bring in institutions that can bring trust into the processes, and so that's where DFIs, particularly institutions like Africa 50, which are owned by governments but have the commercial mindset, can help bridge this gap. Third point that I would mention is power system constraints, which can be quite real. In many cases, the resource is there, the demand can be there, but the grid is not robust enough to support solar projects. And we think big investments are needed in that space. Transmission should be a priority in parallel with investments in generation. We believe at Africa 50 that we could mobilize private capital quite successfully into transmission. So for other countries such as India, for example, has done so quite successfully, Latin America, etc. And we're working here in Kenya on one pilot, a first project on the continent that will be developed as a PPP project. So these are some thoughts, and I can add more.
Thanks,
later.
Anas. I think just to give a broader perspective, when people talk about blended finance, the key principle is that public finance or philanthropic finance leverages private capital. Typically, we have seen that if $1 comes from public sector or philanthropies, it gets $4 worth of private capital moving into that space. So it's critical to see the volume coming there. Second, I think the point I want to highlight that a lot of people have talked about risk for those who are not looking at the risk in a very different way. I give an example of if you have to invest into solar in, say, Germany, the expected return that an investor looks for is around 7 to 8%. If you are investing into India, the expected return is around 14 to 15%. If you are investing into Argentina, it's around 54%. So the geography, the kind of thing plays a big role because of several risks, etc. So local capital and local kind of capacity building is critical, but the role of philanthropic capital is there to minimize the risk or make the risk return appropriate for the private sector to come in. So that's the one point. But I think I have very little time left, and just want to highlight that we were working with International Solar Alliance to set up a blended finance facility for Africa, which has been kind of put in action. It should be launched sometime this year. This facility enables the private sector developers and investors to get risk capital and risk mitigation instruments so that it lowers the cost of capital, as well as provide them some technical assistance and grant so that the project economics can be better. So look forward for that when it happens. The second thing I want to highlight is that we have very, very esteemed speakers on this, so I'll open the floor for a couple of questions. But before that, I want to kind of get a response from each of them, a very short response. And so let me start with Justus. Justus, you have been looking at the investment. You have got the BBox to a scale. Now, you said that the investment environment had changed, right? Now, what a startup, what a venture that is right now looking for capital should do? What is your experience? And very short, like a 2-3 lines that they can think of as a guiding principle that they can take. And what is your ask from the pools of capital? In a very crisp one line that, okay, this is what we require. It can be as simple as saying that, okay, we are getting capital at 15%, we should get capital at 10%. Or we are getting equity, we should get debt. Or we should get as simple. So we get some clarity, that message can be delivered. Over to you, Justus, and then we'll...
Good one. Yeah, I think maybe I would say two things. One, I'm not this panel as a finance, I'm not on this panel as a finance expert, but with my experience and the BBox in general, what's happening at this moment, what are we looking for? I think one, we need investors that understand what we're trying to deliver. I think at this stage of the organizations, you can get desperate for funding and attract the wrong guys and take your business in a completely different direction. So we need the right guys who understand the problem that we are talking about and have real interest and patience in addressing that problem. For a young SME, there's still you don't have a track record like my colleague said. We have some track record. It's different from 5 years ago, from 7 years ago. But we are looking for affordable capital and patient capital. What we are getting now, we are exposed to FX exposure because we are unable to raise enough local capital. And even when we have had some partners come in to provide guarantees, it has also come at a cost. So we want it really affordable and understanding. I think that's a broad thing, but I think it's really important that people stick to what are we trying to solve in the first place. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Wilma, if you can pick up the mic that working with there. So if you can tell me, like you have been using solar not as a solar energy, but solar as kind of productive use. It is enabling something else, right? Do you see challenges different when you are working in that space? Because a lot of discussion we hear about solar as a power production, projects where you produce the power supply to grid, etc. But you are talking about a very different set of solar solutions. So is there anything that you see drastically different in that segment? Because you are having a new kind of technology, new business model. And what is your ask from the larger ecosystem to enable that segment, if it is something very significantly different than what typically we talk about solar?
Let me start with the latter, the ask. We should talk after this. I think, being a company that's in the productive use space, it's proving the integration between the needs of the end user and what we offer. And investors have to see it as a bundled package. We don't, raising for our company as a corporate is very different than raising a facility for the ecosystem. We actually are engaged in both right now. And so I think it's that symbiosis between making sure what we're doing is valuable to the supply chain, the value chains, but also this is another point I want to highlight, is that I think for SMEs, it's really important to stay in the zeitgeist of the moment and go with some of the trends that seem to be driving capital aggregation. What do I mean by that? For example, right now, we are aligning what we do to something called the African Growth and Opportunity Act. It's a bilateral agreement between the U.S. and Kenya, and for those of you who do know it, it's due to expire next year. In 2025. But assuming it's going to be reinstated and extended for another decade, that is a boom opportunity for energy suppliers in terms of connecting what they do to the broader value chain of trade to find investment, to find customers, to find a way to advance sustainability.
Okay. So I think, if I just very crisply summarize what you and Justice are saying, they're saying that investors need to understand our business better and understand the nuances so that, so I'll come back to that, to the investors in the last. But Victor, you talked about the Kenya Climate Venture and your focus on MSME. What is the one thing that you are doing differently when you are treating micro and small enterprise for investment? What is this one thing? This is just for the larger audience to understand that how you're doing differently than you do it for the large projects.
Thanks a lot. So our focus, as you said, is small and medium enterprises in the climate change space, and energy is part of that. And two things we are doing differently. One, we are deploying local currency financing. That's number one. And we do this because we want the SMEs to prosper within their own environment and within their own geography, within their own market. The second thing we do differently is to look at investment in a package. So it's not only capital, but it's also business growth support, because we realize one of the major challenges of small and medium enterprises is the capacity to be able to uptake and deliver on their mandate. But a last one that is important is that there is a big gap, because as a local impact investor, we deploy in local currency. The investors into KCV would really want to listen about receiving or hedging the local forex risk. So, I mean, that is our biggest problem as an investor, and it's also, affecting the extent to which we can invest in SMEs.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think for the point you made about the capacity building support for enterprises, IntelliCap has been supporting almost like 200 enterprises to make them investment ready, and that's a learning that capital is just not enough for them. You need to kind of handhold them so they can absorb the capital and go to the right kind of a stage. And as quickly from you heard the ask from the entrepreneurs, right? We need to understand the businesses, their challenges, and see that in a very nuanced way rather than looking at a sector in a one unified way. When you are going to raise capital, is there any insight from the pools of capital that they're saying that, hey, solar is already we know how to invest in solar. And that is causing a challenge for us because solar has a very different kind of mindset, the large scale solar. Is that a challenge that large scale solar is kind of overshadowing the smaller segments that are emerging?
Thank you. No, I don't see that as a big challenge. I think, capital is readily available from what we see, at least for the large scale side, for, well-developed projects. And that includes solar. I mean, sure, returns have gone down and, it's become easier such projects have become easier. but there is still appetite from global pools of capital for such projects. I think, you know, the concern again that I want to emphasize, the issue really is in getting enough projects to the stage where they can be presented to investors. Again, that is the crucial issue. I think that's where the bottleneck lies today. And I would just emphasize again the need to raise more capital for these earlier stages of projects, which are riskier, for which you know, there is a bit less appetite, and particularly concessional financing that can really help leverage. And we're talking really high potential leverage. For $1 invested in the early stages of the development of a project, that can leverage perhaps up to $20 eventually in investment. So it's really quite interesting, and that's our message, to continue pouring more resources into project development.
Thank you. I have time for 2 questions. So very crisp, and then we can get, yeah, can we get a mic to him? And one there. So 2, 1 here, 1 there. And while the mics are being kind of circulated, I think just to summarize in 2 lines, the small and medium enterprises, the smaller solar segments require approach that they need to be handheld before they are taken to the investors, and they need to be kind of provided concessional and high risk capital dedicated to that so that they can you know, go to the stage. Yeah, please. Thank you. You can use this one if that is giving you trouble.
Thank you. Eric Gonte is my name. I'm a circular economy expert. I think when it comes to financing and access to financing, my recommendation would be we need to become uncomfortable for us to become comfortable. Looking at this market, Africa market and Kenya to be specific, when you talk about MSME, then it comprises 2 groups, the informal and the formal. The risk assessment for both parties then differs. When it comes back to the financing, then we are talking about energy access. The issue to do with management of waste that accrued from the technology that we are talking about. The financing part, the financing for that management is not there. So BBOX end up struggling to finance that activity. The fortunate thing is I've been able to work with BBOX both in Rwanda, Kenya, on the issues to do with waste management, e-waste to be particular. And also, my brothers have mentioned about the innovation in Kenya. So we are seeing institutions struggling to finance the other side of waste management, even when financing component of this aspect was factored in the financing, then it is easier to talk about access and just in transition to energy. Thank you.
So I think that's a comment, so I'll take it that it does not require a response. Well appreciated. The one more question there, you can just pass it on or somebody can keep it. You can come here and then, yeah.
Hi, this is excellent. So just I have a quick, the comment or maybe the question. Like, I've been hearing that all of you are talking about there are 2 sides of it, the supply side and the demand side. The market works in that way. So here we are all talking about the supply side, that how the money can be brought on the table. But what about the demand, like that how the people for whom you are trying to bring the money, are they capable of accepting this money? Are they completely knowledgeable how to use this money and how to approach to get this money? I think that is also sometimes a kind of neglected side. All the time we talk about money, but we don't talk about that how to make the people ready to accept this money. I think that is also one important issue to be taken care of. And the second point is that I would like to specifically ask you that you mentioned about that when you are providing the funding, you also need to see that whether the market is de-risked. Now the question is that when you are talking about the SMEs or the small size companies, it cannot be the responsibility of that small company to clear up all the sharks who are roaming around him. So it is better, like, I think that there should be some system within the facility, right, that de-risking the whole market so that the money can be easily given to them.
So if I can give a quick response, because I get the question. So just quickly, because we're running short of time, most of the blended finance structures have a provision for de-risking instrument that come from the grant and that do that. The first part of your question, that how to kind of get the demand side of that, I think that's a separate conversation altogether. That's a very important point, but I think was not part of the purview of these things. We're focusing more on the supply side. So with this, I think I would like to thank my panelists and the audience for being very patient and listening to all the insights that the panel has. I think one-line summary, we need to focus on those enterprises which are in early and kind of not at a scale that they can be taken to the investors, so that we can build their capacity, we can provide them risk capital, we can provide them the capital they can absorb. And that's critical for making the solar sector growth to the next level, because